It's your job as an author to get the details written correctly inside of your stories, which is why it's so important to talk to different consultants and why we have a former FBI special agent on today's episode of Experts for Authors to make sure that you're writing the FBI authentically in your stories and not swaying the way of Hollywood and the entertainment industry and writing things that will get you called out in your reviews. Today, we're speaking to former special agent Tom Simon, and he's going to break down everything we need to know about authentically and engagingly writing the FBI into our stories.
My name's Tom Simon. I was an FBI special agent for 26 years before I retired. I'm currently a private investigator in Florida. During my time at the FBI, I investigated both criminal and national security matters, and I'd love to tell you about that.
I'm so excited that you're here because we have a lot of authors who do write about the FBI inside of their stories. So, what specifically did you do during your time with the FBI?
Well, when I came in before I was an FBI special agent, I was a certified public accountant. And one of my bosses said that we don't hire CPAs because you're fun to be around. We hire you because we want you to be able to follow the money in financial crime and money laundering cases. As part of that, though, what you find yourself getting very good at is conducting interviews and interrogations, because every case you're interviewing dozens of witnesses, and then it ends with you interrogating the subject of the investigation. And if you're doing your job right, you get a confession. After building that skill set, what happens is you get a reputation for being good at interviews and interrogations. And when it comes time for other people in other cases to conduct that key interrogation to get the confession, I was often brought in on those cases as well to do that. And then there were also just specialty things where we needed to flood a bunch of agents on a missing children cases, a serial killer case, murders on the high seas, and obviously counterterrorism after the 9/11 attacks.
So, as somebody who has spent many, many years of your career working inside of the FBI, we're going to break down what that looks like, how authors can be writing it, and what Hollywood gets wrong. So, I want to jump in with a conversation on job specifications and qualifications. For somebody who is just getting into the FBI, what do we need to know in terms of those qualifications and specifications?
Well, you had to have at least a 4-year college degree. Many of the agents also have master's degrees or law degrees. And then generally people have 3 to 5 years work experience. I would say that the average starting age of an FBI special agent is 29 years old. So people make this a second career, and the vast majority of FBI agents take a pay cut to come in and take the job. And so the FBI is bringing people in from this diversity of backgrounds, whether it's military, law enforcement, the business world, education, with the idea being that all of these skill sets are going to be melded together to form a much better agency to protect the American people.
So, as someone is just stepping into the FBI, I know there's a lot of training that goes into preparing people. What does that look like?
Well, every agent, no matter where you're coming from and no matter what your background is, attends the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. It's kind of nestled in the heart of a Marine Corps base, about an hour and a half south of Washington, D.C. You go through 20 weeks of training, and I like to say it's a kind of a combination of law school and boot camp, where you're learning how to shoot and how to fight and how to handcuff people and various guns and weapons. But you're also learning constitutional law during the day in the classroom and investigation techniques. The FBI Academy has an entire city set up within the FBI Academy with storefronts and businesses and a trailer park and apartments and a motel called Hogan's Alley. And the FBI hires paid actors to come into Hogan's Alley to play the role of crime victims and witnesses and even bad guys, so the students there can conduct mock investigations. The idea being that once you go into the field for your first arrest or case, you've already been through the motions at this Hogan's Alley. And so it was a really useful training for me. And I find the agents coming out of the academy are really well prepared to hit the ground running.
So, we have that generalized training. And I know once you actually get into actively working in the FBI, there are different places that you can work. You've mentioned that you're heavily involved in the financial area. They have specialized training once you kind of figure out what branch you're going to be in?
Yeah, and that generally happens after you graduate from the academy, and then you're put out in the field. You're given a training agent. This is generally a senior agent who kind of takes you under their wing when during your probationary period, just to make sure you're not going to screw up anything too poorly. And there's also opportunities to go back to Quantico or attend other in-service trainings on the specified areas. If you're going into the foreign counterintelligence area involving the Chinese or the Russians, you need to learn a lot about how those investigations work and what the culture of those communities are that you're going to be investigating. By the same token, if you're on the healthcare fraud side, not a lot of people come out really with a keen understanding on how Medicare billing works and how doctors who want to rip off the system could go about doing it. So there's specialized training for them, but that happens after the new agent training at Quantico. The new agent training is the same for every single agent, with the idea being that once you graduate from the academy for that first time, you're fungible. You've learned enough that they can throw you absolutely anywhere based on the needs of the FBI, and you're going to have some level of success.
Interesting. So, with that, based on the needs of the FBI, are they assigning you specific areas, or do you have any say in what kind of generalized area you want to work in?
Well, if you have some specialized skills, like I would say computer science skills tend to be put onto cyber squads where they're dealing with computer intrusions. Like I indicated earlier, financial people like me often are put into the financial crimes, but that's not necessarily a blanket rule. I know plenty of CPAs who are out there on bank robbery squads and handling gang crimes as well. So it's again, it's really up to when you come out of the academy, you're assigned to a squad. A squad is about a dozen agents all working in the same area with a single supervisor, and then non-agent personnel working on that same squad. In big cities, the squads are really specific. This is a healthcare squad, healthcare fraud squad. This is a bank fraud squad. This is a Russian counterintelligence squad. This is an Asian gang squad. But in smaller cities, it's more generalized. There's a white collar crime squad that just does it all for that region. A financial crimes, white collar crime squad, foreign counterintelligence, cyber, counterterrorism, and I'm probably forgetting one or two. But depending on what city you're in, depends on how many squads you're on, and those are the assignments. I wish I could say that the FBI always does a great job of assigning people to the squad that they want, the squad that they're most qualified for. But ultimately, it's what squads need people at that point in time and what people are coming to that particular city. And then the special agent in charge, who's kind of like the police chief for the FBI for that city, gets to make the decision on how to deploy their resources most efficiently.
That makes a lot of sense. So once you are involved with a specific squad or department and you choose later on to change, how easy is it to shift around? Or are you kind of designated there and they tell you when and where you can move?
It's funny you should ask because I'm training agent to a lot. I was, when I was an agent, training agent to a lot of new agents coming out of the academy. And inevitably, no one wants to be on the bank fraud squad or the mail fraud squad, right? They always want to be kicking down doors or rappelling from tall buildings and doing the things that they see in Hollywood. And what I tell them is give it a shot. Your best chance at getting a transfer off the squad is by working really hard and developing a great reputation for yourself as someone who has the ability to make cases. That's the term we use inside the FBI. Oh yeah, he's good. He makes cases. And then eventually your reputation is going to precede you. And then every supervisor in that division is going to know about you and want you to come to their squad. And it gets a bit political at times at the FBI where maybe I know the guy really well in the violent crime squad. He knows I have an ability to make cases. And despite me being a CPA, he's going to lobby upper management to get me onto his squad because he thinks I can add value and put some numbers on the board for him or her.
That makes a lot of sense. So I want to shift gears just slightly because we're kind of talking about the day-to-day operations of what it's like to work inside of the FBI. And I really want to dial down into what a typical day looks like. And this could be a situation where everything is kind of similar, or it could be different day to day. So what does that look like working for the FBI?
Well, it depends a lot on what kind of squad you're on, right? Like the drug squad has a very different day than a bank fraud squad. And so, but let's take an example. A crime has been committed, whether it's let's deal with a situation where a historical crime, whether it's a fraud or a bank robbery or a historical crime, which is different than an enterprise investigation where we're trying to take down a gang or take down a mafia cell. But let's talk about a crime. You're basically going out and you're collating evidence. You're trying to gather evidence of that crime that you're later going to present to the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is the federal prosecutors. And so for me, what that usually meant getting out behind my desk, getting in my car, getting out and going and knocking on doors and speaking to people who were either victims or witnesses of that crime. But I would say that for every day that you spend out in the field doing kind of fun agent work, knocking on doors and asking questions, you're going to spend another day back at the office documenting what you did in the FBI system, writing what we call FD 302s, which is the FBI internal term for the report of the interview. The FBI does not record interviews unless it's the interrogation of a subject. Those are the only interviews we record. So you get really good at taking very copious notes using active listening, like you do when you're conducting your interviews, and then writing up a full report of everything that person told you in a coherent manner to represent what they would testify to if they were called upon to testify. So they don't show you those things in the movies, and they don't write books about the day I spend sitting in front of the computer trying to read my chicken scratch notes. But that happens pretty much 50% of the time. Other days, you're not conducting interviews, you're conducting surveillances where you follow people around and seeing what they do, either to understand their pattern of life or to gather information. Sometimes you have an informant who is actually wearing a wire, a recording device, to go in and talk to the bad guys to get them to say things that might be incriminating. And so you can bring that back. And then you're dealing with all the administration of how to deal with that recording and get it into our evidence storage area so it can later be introduced in court with the proper chain of custody.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about paperwork, and I kind of want to give an overview. I know you can't get too much into details, but when it comes to writing those paperwork type things, what should authors be aware of?
Well, the FBI has an internal system where I'm trying to think what to compare it to. It's basically a report system where it's a database, I guess, for lack of a better word, of all the cases that the FBI is working. You go into that system, you pull down on a pull down menu, you see all the cases that you're working, and then you write your interview report. You write it down by identifying the individual who was interviewed, and then you write it down as if they're telling you exactly what they would say. So it would be Tom Simon, comma, date of birth, comma, social security number, colon, address, phone number, email, provided the following information, colon, and then at that point, it's just a narrative of what that person told you, and you don't have to be saying he said, she said, because you introduce the idea that they are the ones talking in the first paragraph. And that goes through a series of edits where you take a look at it. If you interview the person with a second agent, you have that second agent read it and provide their input. Like, I don't think this is really what they said. I believe what they were really getting at was this. The other thing you need to do is scan your notes into PDFs, your actual handwritten notes, because that becomes evidence in the case in case there's any discrepancy later down the road when they say, I didn't say that. When they take a look at your report a year later when it becomes litigated, then you can also refer to your notes and say, well, this is what I wrote down when you were talking to me. For some reason, did I get that wrong or did you misspeak? And so there's just a lot of, and then the whole thing gets kind of uploaded into the system. A supervisor approves it. And at that point, it's serialized and it can't leave the FBI file at that point. You could, if you needed to amend it or get rid of it, there's no version of we're going to get rid of the documents in this case, like you often see in conspiratorial TV and movies and books. Once that document is serialized, it's not going anywhere. It has to remain there forever.
Now, you mentioned that on occasion, if you're interviewing a suspect, there may be a second agent involved.
Yeah.
How often do you work in teams or in pairs, or do you typically do most of this on your own?
This is the source of great controversy because a lot of agents you're not assigned a partner. So that idea that like in the police shows, like, hey, Tom, here, this is, Jose, he's going to be your partner, or Sally, this is going to be your partner who you'll later fall in love with and make mad love with. That just doesn't happen in real life. It's not a situation. What happens though is that you're on the squad with a dozen people. You're spending a ton of time with these people. And the culture of the FBI is one where it's just part of our culture to help each other out. That hey, if I say to someone, hey, you want to go out and do an interview today? I could use a second set of eyes. Then you can bring that person out in the interview. Eventually, if you become really good friends with that person, you find that you work really well together, and they complement you in the job. And just a good complementary skill set. You end up unofficially partnering with them, where you go on their interviews and they go on your interviews, and you put these cases together as a team. But it's never really formalized in the sense of being like a police partner when two people are on patrol together. I thought my philosophy, I preferred to work alone only because I always just sort of felt bad taking another agent away from their cases to work mine, especially with the financial crime cases, which the witness and victim interviews are rather benign and low risk. The idea of somebody who got ripped off in a Ponzi scheme, like deciding they're going to lunge across the table and stab me, just seemed really low risk. So I did most of those interviews alone, and then would come back. But whenever you do a subject interview, the FBI policy is that there should be another person there. If I'm going to be interviewing somebody who is likely to be charged as a subject of the investigation, you want a second set of eyes there, because that way if something happens to me, if I die, either natural causes or foul play, there's another agent there who can testify to what that person told me. So that's the real rationale for why you need a second person there when you're doing a subject interview. Some of which when the subject is in custody and handcuffs in your office. But I really like doing my subject interviews at the subject's place of business or home to put them at ease so they'll actually talk to you.
How much freedom are you given when deciding the course of your day and how you're running your cases? Do you have to run it constantly by a supervisor? Do you solely get to decide and then handle it, or what does that look like?
A good supervisor will give a good agent total autonomy to manage their caseload. And obviously, if there's a problem child or someone who's underperforming, the supervisor needs to, mentor them a little more. But for the most part, a supervisor loves the idea of having an agent that they can trust to kind of manage their own cases. It's one less person they need to deal with. I think, though, it's a best practice, though, for any agent to check in with their supervisor and let them know what they're doing. One, to cover your rear end for any accusation that you're like, going to the movies or sleeping in your car. And two, I'm not saying this happens. I'm saying that you're
Sure.
always protecting yourself to make sure that your reputation's intact, and
Right.
disappearing all day is not a great thing. And so I always wanted my supervisors, but there's also an officer safety issue, right? You don't
Right.
know when that person's going to break bad on you or if something's
Mhm.
going to happen. So I always really wanted my supervisors to know at every step of the way where I was geographically and what I was doing with my day. Now, the supervisor is going to also have a good feel for what you were doing, because within the next 48 to 36 hours, they're going to see those FD 302 reports of the interviews coming through their desk. So if I disappear for a couple of days and it's not followed by a bunch of documentation of the investigation, a supervisor would be wise to say, Tom, what are you doing with your time? What's happening? What's going on with this case?
That makes a lot of sense. So, can you kind of give me an overview of what the supervisor does? Because it sounds like it's a lot of organization, a lot of paperwork. What does it look like?
Well, it is a lot of paperwork and a lot of supervision. I would say in the old day, a good supervisor has an awareness of what their agents are working. If the supervisor assigns the cases, I think that's the most basic thing that they do. The complaints come in from the public, agents or non-agent personnel write those up. It goes into a system. The supervisor then looks through those complaints, right? So everything from somebody who's hearing voices in their fillings to someone who thinks that their brother is the Unabomber. And the supervisor takes a look at those things and is constantly assessing the credibility and the worthiness of these complaints and the caseload of the dozen agents that works for them, and makes the assignment. Say, Tom's really good with embezzlements and investment fraud. He's not so great with healthcare fraud. Let's assign Tom these cases. Oh, here comes a couple of healthcare fraud cases. Oh, here's a case with lots of Hispanics involved with it in a Mexican subject. Agent Jose speaks Spanish. Let's assign that to them. So the supervisors constantly, both the brake and the gas pedal on the caseloads of the agents. And then they're making sure, a good supervisor again is making sure that you're on track with your case, and that you're carrying a dozen cases, for example, and most agents are carrying about that, maybe more, maybe less. And so they're making sure that every case is moving forward, and that there's serials, these FD 302s, going into the case file at least once, one a month, or you're doing something in every case to keep it moving. You should be able to juggle multiple cases at a time. There's all sorts of reporting requirements that supervisors have as far as kind of how people are spending their time and things like that. But a good supervisor, it has his or her finger on the pulse of their squad and a good understanding of how people are spending their time. And also, if they have a problem agent for some reason or someone who's underperforming, being there to mentor them and make sure that they can become a productive agent, which is what we all want.
In terms of juggling multiple cases, do those tend to vary on how much time investment is going to be put into that, as in smaller cases and larger cases, or is it kind of all a lot of work?
What happens is when you're a new person on a squad, you're usually taking the place of someone else who left the squad. And so you end up inheriting a lot of their cases, which are old dog cases, and no one wants them. It's like finishing someone else's dinner. It's never pleasant. But sometimes the cases are good and worthy of attention. The cases that you like are the ones that you are the genesis of, that were assigned to me, and serial one in that case was written by me, and I'm going to take this to the finish line. We also have to understand that the FBI agents own that case until the subject is sentenced in court, and then and only then can you close that case out. And so different cases are at different points of the investigation. Like what I like to do is I always begin my cases by taking a look and figuring out what bank accounts need to be subpoenaed to get the bank records, because that often takes several months for the banks to comply with a subpoena. So I get those out right away. There's not a whole lot I can do then, so I can set that case aside until the evidence comes in and I can figure out who the victims are that I need to be interviewing. Meanwhile, I have this other case that's kind of hot to trot where I need to get out and knock on doors for a few days and really push on. I have another case that's already been indicted. It's awaiting trial. The prosecutor needs me to make copies of all the evidence so they can present that to the defense attorney in discovery. And so in another case, I have has been convicted and we're awaiting sentencing, and I need to meet with the probation officer who's taking a look at the person to make sure that whether they should stay out or not while they're awaiting their own sentencing. And so because different cases are in different points of the legal cycle of a case, then every day is a little bit different. So it's not like you're dealing with a dozen brand new cases that have just landed on your desk from complaints that have just come in. I would love that because I like the beginning of a case better. It's like dating a new girl, but it's like bottom line is a lot of the cases is an old girl you've been dating for a couple of years now that you're ready to be done with.
I love that analogy. So when it comes to these cases, typically, an average, how long does it typically take to close a case?
To finish a case successfully, depends. I like to say that the timeline of a case, I spend about a year investigating. If it's just a normal like investment fraud with say a dozen victims and $1 million in losses, I can do that in about a year of actual field work. Then I'm going to get another prosecutor's desk. The prosecutor is going to get to it when he or she gets to it because they have a dozen agents who are giving them completed cases. I always try to create my case, package my cases in a way that they rise to the top of the stack. But I would say as that thing winds through the criminal justice system, in most financial crime cases, the bad guy pleads guilty. But even that's a good 10 months after that. And so one of the things I need to always control my victims' expectations is I need to say, they're all accustomed to watching television, right? Where a case comes in the door and then an hour later, the bad guy is being led to prison. And so they have this inflated expectation of how quickly these cases can be completed, but it's really about a 2-year cycle. If everything goes well between the first complaint coming in the door, me completing the investigation, then the prosecutor doing their job, negotiating a plea, and the bad guy actually being sentenced to prison. If everything goes right, that's a 2-year cycle.
Okay. That's really good information. And I like that you mentioned that within the entertainment world, we often see these very quick turnarounds and these very quick time frames. What other things does Hollywood and the entertainment industry get wrong about the FBI?
Oh, where do I start? I feel like screenwriters need to all take civics lessons. I think the first thing is just a real lack of understanding on what is a federal crime and what is a local crime. All right, federal crimes by their very nature are interstate, right? It involves more than one state. Or it took place on a federal reservation, or the government's a victim. And so if I murder you at the local gas station, that's not a federal crime. If I murder you on the local military base, it probably is, or on the steps of the Pentagon. And so I see a lot of that where FBI agents are investigating cases that's really none of the FBI's business whatsoever. My big pet peeve, the thing I hate the most that I see in books, movies, TV, is the idea that the FBI is some sort of super police and we come in to take cases from the police when they're investigating those. You saw that in the movie Die Hard, right? The idea that the police had it all under control, they're negotiating, they're making things happen. And then the very arrogant FBI agent comes in and basically step aside for the big boys. That never, ever happens in real life. In 26 years of doing it, I've never, ever seen the FBI come in and take a case from the police. Again, it's either a federal crime or it's a state crime, and there's very little overlap between the two. If, however, there's a conflict where we could work the case or the police can work the case, the FBI is encouraged to, and the police love working together, just partnering up with a police detective and actually working the case to its logical conclusion. And you could decide down the road if the taxpayers are going to get a bigger bang for their buck through a state prosecution or a federal prosecution. The FBI doesn't care. All we want to do is make sure the bad guy gets locked up. So that one drives me absolutely bananas when that happens. And I think the movie Rush Hour, at some point, there was a scene where it was almost like the police officer Chris Tucker was being brought up to the major leagues because he was going to go work for the FBI now. Like, is this somehow the police or something secondary? And it drove me nuts. And it's just lazy writing. It's just really lazy writing. There's just little things like a federal prosecutor is known as an assistant United States attorney. They all work for the United States attorney, who is a presidential appointee, and they are part of the U.S. Department of Justice. I see a lot of people talking about the district attorney who's prosecuting this federal case, and again, it's like don't these authors have Google? I mean, this is really, really basic kind of civics class stuff, but people get it wrong so much. Then you get the criminal legal process about how an arrest warrant happens, how a search warrant is issued. Oh God, the idea of a wiretap, the idea that I'm going to be able to like flip a switch and just listen to your phone calls because I'm mildly curious what you're saying, and I think they might be saying something like really interesting to my case. The amount of work that goes into getting what we call a Title III wiretap order from a judge that allows me to listen to your phone calls is astronomical. And same with what we call a FISA warrant, which is the national security version of that. The hoops that the agent has to go through and the legal hurdles they have to do to invade your privacy to such an extent that I'm going to listen to your phone calls is insane. It's not me shimmying up a phone pole and putting a tap on your phone. So that also drives me nuts. I feel like I'm in a therapy session now with the stuff that Hollywood gets wrong because I can't read FBI books because they make me so crazy. And so, and it's also so preventable because for a while I worked as the public affairs person for the FBI in both Chicago and Honolulu. And one of our missions is that we will take calls from authors who have technical questions like the stuff we're talking about right now. And I'm supposed to talk to them. I'm supposed to give them information. I'm supposed to guide them on how to get it right if they have an interest in getting it right. Most authors don't. And so every single author out there, especially if you're an American author, has the right to literally just call your local FBI office, ask to speak to the public affairs person and say, hey, what kind of gun do agents carry this time? And then the agent will the person will tell them, and then so they can get it right. The FBI doesn't want you getting it wrong. We want, they're interested in pushing their own kind of agenda and looking good to the taxpayers, but we also want people to get it right. And so the laziness out there is just staggering.
Okay, let's dial in on that a little bit more because if authors who are listening do want to reach out and contact the FBI to ask those questions, how do they do that? Where do they find that information? And what process should they do to make sure they're doing it in the right way?
Right. Okay. It's a very obscure tool called Google. If you literally Google, if the author lives in Lexington, Kentucky, they can type in FBI Lexington, Kentucky. It'll pull up the phone number for the local FBI office. You pick up your phone and you call the local FBI office and say, I'd like to speak to the public affairs person or the media representative. And it's going to be an actual flesh and blood human being, not some call center in India. And it's going to be a person who wanted that job and applied for that job and wants to help you. And you would say, hey, I have a couple of questions on how an agent spends their day. How many agents on a squad? What, as long as you're not asking for like national security secrets or where we're hiding the UFOs, they're going to help you out. And they're going to give you an honest answer that you can use for your book. And it doesn't cost you anything. It doesn't, you don't have to thank that person. You don't have to name a character after that person. You don't owe that person royalties. It's just the taxpayers deserve to have these questions answered if they want to just call up the FBI and ask because they're working on a book. It's very easy. And no one's going to say, are you crazy? And hang up the phone. That's not what we did.
That's very interesting. Now, is there a better time of day that we should be calling in? Is it kind of busy in the afternoons or the evenings? Should we avoid weekends?
Well, avoid weekends, right? But I mean, those people are always drinking from a fire hose. You may end up having to leave a voicemail and they'll get back to you. But there's no time of day. I mean, basically, they're also responding to news inquiries as well. So, so when the governor of a state is being led from the state house in handcuffs, they're getting a lot of calls. But on a Friday afternoon, when there's not a whole lot going on, I was getting calls from reporters saying, "There's nothing happening in our city. Please tell me something I can put on the news tonight." And so you get a bit of that too. So,
how often were you speaking to news reporters? Do they call in often?
Well, again. I was in a unique situation because most public affairs people for the FBI, it's a full-time job. For me, it was like a side hustle. It was a collateral duty. So I got to actually go out and investigate cases. And then I also got to be the person that when a reporter called and said, I want to speak to an agent, I got to take those calls. And so I got, and for the 15 years of my career that I was the press spokesperson, it was great. I was getting calls every day. I knew the local reporters. Sometimes I was getting tips from them about cases they had stumbled upon, which is very nice and helpful. And I was always happy to, I had a very good relationship with the reporters. I didn't see it as hostile or adversarial at all. They were trying to do their job. Their job is very similar to my job as an investigator because they're trying to gather information and then present it to the public in a way they can understand. That's what agents do, right? I gather information and I'm going to present it to the public, being 12 people on a jury so they can understand what happened. the reporters had very similar jobs. And a lot of the times, the questions they were asking about were about pending investigations, and the FBI is not allowed to confirm or deny the existence of any ongoing investigation. And so I must have said those words maybe 100,000 times during the times where I was talking to reporters, and the reporters get it. They understand their job is to call and ask that question in case I do something really stupid and talk about something that they can make news with. But for the most part, they understood that I was playing by a set of rules promulgated by the Department of Justice down to me.
So, when it comes to interacting with the press, you've mentioned that most of them are pretty reliable and pretty easy to get along with. We know that Hollywood loves to tell us that we are at each other's throats when it comes to reporters and law enforcement agents. So, do you feel like it's pretty much people being respectful?
I mean, I guess it depends how competitive the media market is, right? I had nothing but good experiences. I never had a reporter screw me over. If I gave a reporter a really crummy quote, especially a newspaper reporter, I would like sometimes reflect upon it and say, I'm going to get in a lot of trouble if they print that. And I could call the reporter back and say, can I redo that? And they would always said yes. When I'm on camera on the courthouse steps, it's never live. They're usually recording for 6 p.m. And if I do a very bad job in providing my soundbite, I can say, let me do that again. I think I can give you a better soundbite if you let me do that again. They were always nice about doing that. However, being in kind of the community of public affairs people, everybody has nightmare stories, right? We had a reporter from Rolling Stone magazine who came down to do a story about our joint terrorism task force in Chicago. And he just really did a hatchet job. It was you could tell that he came there with the agenda to embarrass the FBI and make us look like the Keystone Cops. But I took solace in knowing that there's nothing that I was going to be able to do in getting to know this guy and providing him with the information he needed to do his stories that was going to rehabilitate him or change his mind. And candidly, he's got a First Amendment right to write whatever he wants. And so while it's annoying to me to sit there and read Rolling Stone magazine, crapping all over my colleagues, I understand that one, people aren't turning to Rolling Stone magazine for the best and brightest reporting, and two, the guy has a right to say what he says, and all I can do is all I can do, and I can't control how he decides he wants to portray him. You got to, I think, like all things in life, you need to kind of get your hands around the things that are under your control and the things that aren't.
Fantastic point. I want to switch gears just a little bit because I want to talk about equipment of the trade.
Yeah.
So, as an FBI agent, what are some of the pieces of equipment that we need to use? Everything from weaponry to technology. What does that look like?
Okay, so every agent is issued the same firearm. So it's not and that firearm is currently a Glock 9mm. I believe it's called a Glock 16. I was never really a gun aficionado, so that changes over time. There were times where we were carrying a gun called a Sig Sauer 9mm, and then we switched to a Glock 40 caliber. And then there was some technological improvement in bullets that they felt that it was better to go back to the 9mm. But as of today, on the recording date at the bottom of this YouTube video, FBIs are carrying a Glock 16, which is a 9mm. I believe it holds 14 in the magazine and one in the chamber. You can tell I'm not like a gun enthusiast. I just carried a gun for 30 years. And so everybody carries that at all times. Like you're walking around the office, that's on your hip. And every agent is going to be issued handcuffs. For the most part, a good agent's going to have those with them at all times. I'll tell you honestly, there's times where the agent didn't have it or had it in their glove compartment or whatever. An agent who was working, for example, foreign counterintelligence, and their job is not really to arrest people. It's to catch the spies and follow the diplomats and things like that in our country. They don't really need to have their handcuffs on them at all times for their job, but I think it's probably a good idea. I think they would say in a moment of honesty that they should have it because you never know when something crazy is going to break out. You're issued extra clips, magazines where bullets are held. For the most part, agents aren't carrying extra magazines unless they're out there doing something particularly dangerous, like an arrest or maybe a search warrant, perhaps a surveillance. The idea being that the rounds, the bullets in your gun are going to probably be sufficient for anything that kind of you come upon in the normal day-to-day life. We are issued we don't use tasers in the FBI. The FBI is not a taser agency. It is a pepper spray agency where we're all pepper sprayed at the academy so we can know what it feels like. It's a terrible experience, but I don't know of any agent that carries their pepper spray on them on a day-to-day basis. Again, perhaps on an arrest. We have an ASP baton. ASP is the brand. It's a collapsible baton. You like snick it out and it telescopes out. It's not like a giant police baton. We're all issued those. I don't know any agent who carries that on a day-to-day basis, but it might be something on your belt if you're going to do an arrest or a search warrant where you're kind of going in a door that you don't know what's behind the door. You're also issued a bulletproof vest. Over the years, they've gotten thinner and thinner and thinner. The current one is really thin. I could probably be wearing it right now under the shirt. You wouldn't even notice. It's really great technology. There are agents who wear that if they're out there conducting surveillance or if they're doing interviews or something like that in bad neighborhoods. For the most part, I would say 99% of all agents are not wearing that, but it is absolutely required that you wear that in any arrest. You can be suspended if you're not wearing that during your arrest. Nobody wants to go to a fellow agent's funeral. I'm trying to think what else. Every agent is issued an FBI car that we call it a BU car, BUCAR, BU for Bureau. It's generally an American car, although lately I've been seeing some Hyundais and Toyotas made in America that have been in the fleet. There's no uniformity to the cars for obvious reasons. The cars are there's no marking on it to indicate that they're government vehicles, and the license plates all come back to fake names and addresses. Because sometimes we're called upon to investigate police officers, and they don't necessarily need to know that car sitting across the street watching them is an FBI car. The cars are only for the agents are allowed to commute to and from work in the car, but you are not allowed to take anyone in your car. That's not unofficial business. So I can't take my wife to the movies on a Saturday night in my BU car, or it's going to get me 6 weeks suspension. No muss, no fuss. I also can't use that car for personal use. I can't decide that I want to go to the movies alone and go and use that car. And agents have gotten themselves in trouble for doing that. They call it 6 weeks on the bricks for misusing an FBI car. I'm trying to think of any other interesting equipment or gadgets. For the interesting gadgets, which people like to write about or you see in the movies, those are things that work almost in a library. Like if I want to get a recording device that looks like a baseball hat or a tie pin or something like that, I basically go to a office in that FBI division where the technically trained agents work, and I check that out like a library book. It's my responsibility. I need to give it back to them after I'm done using it. Most agents aren't walking around with like a supply of interesting gadgets and recording devices, but they're available to you 24/7 if you need them for a case.
Okay. In terms of technology and computers and things like that, do you have agency assigned computers and phones and things that you're required to use?
Yeah, okay. I'm sorry. You're issued a cell phone. I wish it was an iPhone, and the FBI agents have been lobbying for iPhones for a long time. But I think right now they're using Google phones or something on a Android system, and the agents are always frustrated with that. There's a lot of security on the phone. I feel like you have to type like the Great American Novel just to unlock it at times. That was always a real pain in the neck. So that's the phone. You're at your desk. You have two computers. One is just a standalone internet computer in case you need to do some Googling. And the other is on the FBI system where you would write your FD 302s and your interview reports and kind of maintain your cases. There's an air gap between those computers, so nothing can accidentally spill off into the internet. So again, writers out there who are watching, the idea of some 16-year-old kid with a baseball hat on who's going to hack into the FBI system on the internet to see what's going on in a particular case, sheer nonsense, absolutely impossible. None of these computers are linked to the internet in any way, shape, or form. So you can make that a plot device, but every FBI agent is going to be throwing popcorn at the screen.
I love that. Talk to me a little bit about an agent's workspace. Is it a public area? Do they have offices? What does that look like?
It's the source of great controversy. It's a cubicle, and the cubicles seem to be getting smaller over the years. The FBI is it's a federal agency, right? And so there's a government agency called the General Services Administration, or the GSA. They are the landlords for the U.S. government, and they provide the standards for how much workspace every federal employee has, whether you are a clerk with the Office of Health and Human Services or an FBI special agent. And so it's probably, 10 square feet. A lot of agents are moving now to stand-up desks because we tend to be a physically fit bunch of people. And there's usually a kind of like a half wall up between you and the next agent. The kind of bullpen environment is great. I love it because it allows you to share information. There have been probably more than 10 times in my career where I'm talking to someone on the phone and I'm asking questions I'm doing an interview on the phone about somebody, and I'll hang up and the agent across from me will go, you need to talk to Christine. I think she's investigating the same guy, or there's overlap between her cases. And so that kind of like lack of a sound barrier, where if I was in my own office, there'd be much less of a sharing of information. And it really, really helps the new agents to be in that kind of bullpen where there's a dozen agents on the phone, kind of managing their cases, printing documents and just chit-chatting with each other about best practices and their cases. And that's how new agents learn, probably even more so than Quantico. It's just kind of being in the presence of a dozen senior agents who know what they're doing. You gain so much knowledge from that. So even if we had like ivory towers and beautiful like discotheque looking offices like you see on the show 24, I don't know that you would want that. The cubicles really lend to the information sharing and the cooperation and collaboration among agents that make the FBI a special place to work.
So this really is a very collaborative environment for agents to be working in.
Yes, and more so than other agencies. I am told that the IRS, for example, Criminal Investigative Division, who are excellent agents, they're competing for their promotions. So we work on a GS scale, and it's like high school. You come in as a GS 10, you're making, I don't know, $65,000 a year or something like that. And every year you get like a promotion, unless you do something really, really stupid where you don't get promoted, or unless you're such a superstar that you become a supervisor, in which case you jump some of those steps. But you're going to get that promotion and that raise, whether no matter whether you're a superstar or whether you're just doing your job minimally. And so I'm not competing against that guy next to me to see who gets the promotion. Other agencies, and I believe the IRS, at least they were, because I know I had friends who worked there, they were competing against the people on their squads for that just promotion, that pay raise. And so it creates a really bad culture, I think, where maybe I'm not excited about helping that guy because he's going to be taking money out of my pocket if I don't do that. And so the FBI realized very early on, probably 110 years ago, that the idea of pitting agent against agent for money and promotions is just a recipe for disaster as far as being able to kind of help each other out. So I've never seen a more collaborative environment and people more willing to kind of set their cases aside, especially if it's getting out of the office. A lot of times you get bogged down when you do a search warrant or you get your subpoena records back and you're just spending a ton of time in the office, like pouring through records or phone records, or if you're on a wiretap listening to the calls that have come in, and it becomes mind numbing and you just want to get outside and knock on some doors and get out of the office. And so the idea of going out with another agent where you're not really responsible for making the case, but you're doing all the fun stuff as far as conducting the interview, that's a real joy. You're actually doing people a favor by asking them to do that.
That makes a lot of sense. And this has been very valuable information. What other things do you feel authors need to know about writing FBI agents realistically?
Well, I think that we're people, like the idea that we're all like super stiff. I mean, some of the funniest people I've ever met have been FBI agents, and so there's a lot of personalities there. There's no one political, like right now everyone's absolutely convinced that the FBI are either right wing maniacs or left wing maniacs. I have no idea how any of my colleagues have ever voted. It's just not part of the culture of the FBI is that you're not political. You're not. I mean, we investigate politicians. We lock them up. I've locked up plenty of politicians. And so there's always sort of a distaste for politics in general, and it's just considered tacky and gross to be talking politics. So the idea that FBI agents are like super sympathetic to Trump or out to get Trump is just nonsense. That's not the way it works. It's not the culture of the FBI. So I think that's one thing. And again, the FBI agents who are working mothers, they have pictures of all their kids on their desk. They miss their kids. They got all that working mother guilt that someone who's working in an accounting firm has. And so the humanity of the agents, I think, is something that authors can do a much better job of expressing. And and that their life is not the cases. Most of them are able to go home, set their work aside, and be that little league coach for their kids, or that mom who's going to take their kid to kindergarten for their first day of school. And so I think a lot of that often gets lost because people focus on our job, and Hollywood often makes us look like we're just these androids.
I feel that a lot, especially in the entertainment industry. They have a very interesting perception of how all of this works. This has been so incredibly informative. If people want to check you out more or reach out to you with questions, where's the best place for people to find you online?
Well, I am all over social media, sadly. And my private investigative firm is Simon Investigation. So if you go to simoninvestigations.com, you can see all about me if you wanted to hire me as a private investigator. But if you want to follow my social media on Instagram and TikTok, my username is Simon Investigations. My name's Tom Simon on YouTube. It shouldn't be that hard to find me because I suspect that everyone watching is also a trained investigator.
There is an entire series here on the YouTube channel about experts for authors where we talk to everyone from swap breachers and detectives to CIA analysts to FBI agents, lawyers to molecular anthropologists, airline captains, and more. Now, we are having Tom back for another episode all about private investigators, so make sure you hit that subscribe and notification bell because you do not want to miss out on this really valuable information that is so different from what Hollywood tells us it is. If you have a profession you want to see on the series, drop it down below and I'll do my best to find an expert for you, and I'll see you in our next episode of Experts for Authors and daily videos here on the YouTube channel about publishing, writing, and growing your business in this industry.